For 30 years, every military advisor who briefed the White House on Iran said the same thing behind closed doors. Do not do this. Every chairman of the Joint Chiefs, every Secretary of Defense, every strategic planner who had actually run the numbers. Bush heard it, Obama heard it, Biden heard it twice in a single year when pressure built in 2024. The answer never changed. Iran is not Iraq. It is 4 times the size, 3 times the population, geography that would be a nightmare for any invading force, and the demonstrated capacity to threaten the single most important energy corridor on the planet. The question that analysts across the world are now asking is what happens when that institutional resistance gets overridden? What happens when political calculation replaces military judgment? And what happens when the country on the receiving end turns out to be far more strategically capable than Washington publicly admitted? Those answers are already unfolding, and they affect not just the Middle East, they affect every economy, every gas station, and every household budget on Earth. If you find this kind of analysis valuable, the kind that goes deeper than the daily headlines, take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. We genuinely read them, and this kind of independent coverage only continues with your support. Now let's get into it. To understand how this situation reached its current point, you have to understand the pressure campaign that ran for decades. According to multiple reports confirmed by former American officials, there was sustained and aggressive lobbying to draw the United States into direct military confrontation with Iran. The argument was always consistent: the regime is fragile, a decisive strike at the top would cause it to collapse, destroy the nuclear sites, hit the leadership, and a government friendly to Western interests would emerge from the wreckage. The military never accepted that argument, not out of reluctance to use force, but because they had studied the problem thoroughly. The Pentagon wargamed a conflict with Iran on a regular basis. Every simulation arrived at the same conclusion: you could bomb Iran, hit every known nuclear facility, destroy every significant government building in Tehran, and when the smoke cleared, you would still be facing a country of 90 million people spread across terrain that makes Afghanistan look manageable, with an arsenal of short and medium-range ballistic missiles capable of setting the entire Gulf on fire. That assessment never changed. What changed was who was listening to it. Here is where the strategic picture becomes genuinely alarming, and it is something most mainstream coverage has barely addressed. According to military analysts and several defense officials who have spoken on record or on background, Iran did not respond the way anyone in Washington anticipated. The assumption was that Iran would attempt to strike back at American military assets directly: carrier groups, air bases, the kinds of hardened targets the U.S. military is designed to defend. Instead, according to multiple reports, Iran pursued what strategists call an asymmetric economic warfare strategy. Rather than going after the warships, they went after the money. Energy infrastructure across the Gulf became the primary target set: oil terminals, refineries, loading platforms, pipeline junctions, desalination plants that entire nations depend on for their drinking water. These are not hardened military targets. They are sprawling, exposed, and nearly impossible to comprehensively defend. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of this strategy. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through that narrow waterway every single day. Iran controls the northern shore. Naval analysts assess that Iran has the capability to mine the strait, deploy fast attack boats, and launch anti-ship missiles from concealed coastal positions that would make keeping the corridor open extraordinarily costly. Reports indicate Iran moved quickly to threaten this choke point, not by closing it entirely at first, but by making transit dangerous and unpredictable enough that shipping insurance rates skyrocketed and commercial operators began rerouting. Global oil prices surged almost immediately, and that was before any full closure. What makes this strategy so effective, according to defense analysts, is that Iran does not need to win a conventional military battle to achieve its objectives. It needs only to sustain enough pressure that the economic pain becomes politically unbearable in Washington. This connects to what several prominent strategists describe as the most dangerous feature of the conflict: the escalation problem. Washington relies on a concept called escalation dominance, the idea that the United States can always go one step higher than its adversary, and the adversary will eventually back down, knowing it cannot match American firepower. In theory, this logic is sound. In practice, it repeatedly runs into a wall the historical record has been building for decades. Air campaigns alone have never produced regime change. Not once. The United States firebombed Tokyo on the night of March 10, 1945, killing more people in a single night than died at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki combined. Japan did not surrender. The U.S. then systematically destroyed every major Japanese city for 5 more months. Japan still did not surrender. It took 2 nuclear weapons and a Soviet invasion of Manchuria. In Korea, the United States essentially leveled North Korea from the air, every significant structure destroyed, devastation difficult to comprehend today. The regime did not fall. In Vietnam, the U.S. dropped more bomb tonnage than in all of the Second World War. The regime did not fall. In every case, civilian populations rallied around their government rather than against it. When analysts hear talk of bombing Iran into submission or destroying enough infrastructure to compel regime change through air power, the historical response is unambiguous: it does not work. It has never worked. There is no credible reason to believe it would work now against a country larger, more geographically dispersed, and more ideologically cohesive than most of those historical examples. This is the trap strategists warned about before the conflict began. You start bombing because you believe it will be quick and decisive. When it isn't, you bomb harder. When that still doesn't work, you escalate again. Each step brings new consequences, and each consequence creates pressure toward the next step. If the United States or its allies target Iranian energy infrastructure, Iran retaliates against Gulf energy infrastructure. If desalination plants inside Iran are struck, reports suggest Iran would target equivalent facilities in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and potentially Israel. Several of these nations are almost entirely dependent on desalinated water. Destroying those plants does not merely create economic damage, it produces a humanitarian catastrophe within days. This is where the global economic picture becomes genuinely frightening. The world runs on oil. This is not a political statement, it is a basic physical and economic reality. Oil powers not just transportation but industrial production, electricity generation, shipping, agriculture, chemical manufacturing, and virtually every supply chain on the planet. When Gulf oil supply is disrupted at scale, the effects do not remain contained, they cascade. European nations face acute vulnerability. After losing access to cheap Russian energy following the war in Ukraine, Europe pivoted toward increased reliance on Middle Eastern and American sources. A significant Gulf disruption layered on the existing Russian shortfall could push multiple European economies already stagnating into genuine crisis. Energy prices would spike. Industrial output would contract. Inflation, barely brought under partial control, would surge again. Japan and South Korea are in an even more exposed position. Both nations are heavily dependent on Gulf oil imports with limited strategic reserves relative to their consumption. A sustained disruption would hit their economies within weeks, not months. The damage would not stop at developed nations. Countries across Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, nations like Nigeria, Pakistan, and Bangladesh already managing fragile economic conditions, could be pushed into severe crisis by energy price shocks they have no capacity to absorb. Several economists have used the word depression, not recession. Depression. That represents a worst-case scenario rather than a certainty, but the fact that credible analysts are modeling this possibility conveys the seriousness of what is at stake. There is another dimension to this conflict that has not received adequate attention: the role of Russia and China. Both nations have powerful strategic incentives to see the United States struggle in a prolonged Middle Eastern conflict. This is not speculation, it is basic strategic logic that both governments have articulated in various forms over the past decade. A United States pinned down and burning through military resources under domestic political pressure over an unpopular war has less bandwidth to focus on the Indo-Pacific or Eastern Europe. According to multiple intelligence assessments reported in Western media, Russia has been providing significant intelligence support to Iran: satellite imagery, electronic signals data, real-time information about the positioning and movement of American and Allied assets. This is precisely what the United States has done for Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. The symmetry is not lost on anyone involved. China's role, according to analysts, has focused more on technology transfers. Reports that surfaced before the current escalation described China supplying advanced air defense systems and long-range radar capable of tracking stealth aircraft. If accurate, this would significantly complicate American air operations and reduce the effectiveness of what has traditionally been the U.S. military's greatest advantage, its ability to strike with near impunity from altitude. According to several analysts, Russian and Chinese support for Iran is likely to increase rather than decrease as the conflict continues. Both nations see an opportunity to accelerate the shift toward a multipolar world order. A decisive American setback in the Middle East would, in their calculation, fundamentally reshape how every government on Earth evaluates the value of an American security guarantee. This leads directly to what may be the most consequential piece of the entire puzzle, the Gulf states. For decades, the security architecture of the Persian Gulf rested on a single premise: the United States would protect Gulf nations from Iran. American bases, American ships, American missile defense systems, all stationed across the region, as a guarantee that Iran could not threaten its neighbors without encountering American power. According to multiple reports, that premise is now being questioned more seriously than at any point in modern history. The Gulf states were not consulted before the current escalation. They did not participate in the decision-making process. They are now absorbing the consequences of a war they did not choose, in the form of Iranian strikes on infrastructure their populations depend on for survival. Several Gulf nations had already begun hedging before the current conflict. Saudi Arabia's strategic partnership with Pakistan, which reportedly includes a nuclear security component, is one example. Turkey's interest in joining that arrangement is another. These are not the actions of nations confident in American protection. They are the actions of nations searching for alternatives. The fundamental question Gulf leaders are reportedly grappling with is whether American bases on their soil have become assets or liabilities. Before the current conflict, the answer seemed obvious. Now, according to several diplomatic sources, it is not obvious at all. Those bases, intended to deter Iran, have instead turned Gulf nations into targets. Infrastructure that was meant to provide security has attracted the strikes now threatening the economic and humanitarian foundations of these countries. All of this returns to the most critical question: how does this end? According to virtually every strategic analyst who has commented publicly, no clear off-ramp is visible. The domestic political framing in Washington focuses on American and Israeli objectives: regime change, unconditional surrender, decisive victory. But these conversations almost entirely ignore the reality that Iran must agree to any resolution, and Iran, based on all available evidence, has no incentive to accept terms that do not address its core demands. Analysts point to three primary Iranian requirements. First, comprehensive sanctions relief. Sanctions have strangled the Iranian economy for years, and any deal leaving them intact would be seen domestically as a defeat. Second, credible security guarantees. Iran has been attacked twice in less than a year, according to reports, and any agreement without assurances against future attacks would be rejected. Third, reparations. Whether through direct payments or frozen asset releases, analysts suggest Iran will demand economic compensation. The political difficulty for Washington is obvious. Meeting these demands would appear to domestic audiences as concession. Concession during an election cycle is something no American president wants to be associated with. But the alternative, continuing a war driving the global economy toward crisis, eroding alliances, and demonstrating the limits of American power, carries its own devastating political cost. Several analysts have drawn comparisons to the final years of the Vietnam War, when American leadership understood privately that the conflict was unwinnable, but continued fighting because no one wanted to be the administration that lost. The cost of that delay was measured in years of additional destruction and thousands of additional lives. One dimension that deserves particular attention concerns nuclear proliferation. According to multiple analysts, the current conflict is accelerating proliferation pressures across the Middle East. If Iran emerges more determined to pursue a nuclear weapons capability, and several experts believe this is now the most likely outcome, it would trigger a cascade across the region. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, Nations that historically relied on American security guarantees would face intense domestic pressure to pursue their own nuclear deterrence. The irony that analysts keep returning to is this: the conflict intended to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power may ultimately guarantee that it does, and bring several of its neighbors along with it. There is a detail that surfaces repeatedly in expert discussions, but rarely makes it into mainstream coverage, and it fundamentally changes how you understand the conflict's trajectory. It concerns the missile defense equation. The United States and Israel operate some of the most sophisticated defensive systems ever built: Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow, THAAD, Patriot batteries. On paper, they represent an impenetrable shield. In practice, they face a mathematical problem that no amount of technology fully resolves. Defensive interceptors are expensive. Offensive missiles and drones are cheap. Every interceptor fired costs anywhere from several $100,000 to several $1 million. Many of the drones being launched cost a fraction of that. More critically, interceptors are finite. Once stockpiles are exhausted, replenishment takes months, sometimes years. You cannot surge production overnight. Iran possesses, according to military assessments, one of the largest ballistic missile arsenals in the Middle East. Thousands of short-range missiles, hundreds of medium and long-range missiles, and an enormous inventory of drones that can be produced quickly and cheaply. The math is simple and brutal. If Iran launches enough projectiles in sustained waves, the defense systems run dry, and once they run dry, everything behind them is exposed. Reports suggest a significant portion of American interceptor stockpiles are being redirected to Israel, which creates a secondary problem. Every interceptor sent to Israel is one no longer available to protect Gulf installations or American bases elsewhere in the region. This produces a zero-sum competition for defensive resources among allies simultaneously under threat. It cannot be solved by building more interceptors on the timeline of this conflict. It is a structural vulnerability that Iran appears to understand and is reportedly exploiting deliberately through sustained, distributed attacks designed to exhaust defensive capacity over time rather than overwhelm it in a single strike. Military historians have identified this pattern across centuries: the defender's dilemma. When you are required to defend everything, you effectively defend nothing completely. Iran does not need to know the precise location of every defensive battery. It simply needs to launch enough projectiles across enough targets to ensure some penetrate. In a target-rich environment like the Persian Gulf, where critical infrastructure is concentrated and exposed, even a small success rate can cause catastrophic damage. This is why several former military officials have described the current strategic position as fundamentally unsustainable, not because American forces lack capability, but because the nature of this conflict favors the attacker in ways no defensive technology can fully offset. There is also what this conflict is doing to America's broader global position. The United States maintains military commitments on every continent, security obligations in Europe where NATO depends on American leadership, commitments in the Indo-Pacific where China's expanding military capabilities require constant attention, partnerships across Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia. Every resource committed to the Middle East is unavailable elsewhere. Every ship in the Gulf is not in the South China Sea. Every interceptor sent to Israel cannot be positioned in South Korea or Japan. According to strategic analysts, this is precisely the scenario both Russia and China have been anticipating. An America stretched thin, burning through expensive munitions in a conflict producing no clear victory, while global competitors use the distraction to advance their own positions. Several analysts have noted increased Chinese military activity near Taiwan in recent months, coinciding with American attention almost entirely absorbed by the Middle East. Whether this represents deliberate opportunism or coincidental timing is debated. The strategic effect is the same. What strategists call imperial overstretch has been studied extensively by historians examining the decline of the Roman Empire, the collapse of the British Empire, and the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Great powers decline not through a single decisive defeat, but through the cumulative drain of commitments that exhaust their strength while failing to generate strategic returns proportionate to the cost. What makes this moment different from previous American military engagements is the speed at which economic consequences are materializing. In Vietnam, costs accumulated over years. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the financial burden built gradually across 2 decades. In the current conflict, the economic shock has been nearly instantaneous because of the Gulf's centrality to the global energy system. Markets have already priced in significant disruption. But according to several economists, current pricing may actually underestimate the risk because it assumes a relatively brief conflict. If the situation becomes protracted, if the Strait of Hormuz remains partially or fully restricted for months rather than weeks, the economic models analysts rely on enter territory without modern precedent. The last comparable disruption to global energy supply was the 1973 oil embargo, which triggered a global recession, reshaped international politics, and fundamentally altered the relationship between energy-producing and energy-consuming nations. That embargo involved a fraction of the supply volume currently at risk. The situation is balanced on a knife's edge. There are scenarios in which diplomatic channels produce a resolution before the worst economic and humanitarian consequences materialize. There are also scenarios in which escalation continues, costs compound, and this conflict becomes the kind of generational strategic miscalculation that reshapes the international order. Every credible analyst agrees the danger is real. The question is whether the people making the decisions fully understand the depth of what they are navigating, and whether the historical patterns being traced right now give us enough time to find a different path before the consequences become irreversible. If you watched this far and found this analysis valuable, the kind that connects historical patterns to the strategic realities that most coverage skims past, please subscribe, hit the like button, and share this with someone who needs the full picture. Leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. This kind of independent analysis only continues because of viewers who engage with it and help it reach more people. Thank you for being here. The story continues.